Two puppies trembled as they begged a little girl for help, but what they discovered afterward brought everyone to tears. Before we begin this story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The heat was the kind that made the air shimmer above the asphalt, rippling like a mirage. In Willow Creek, Arizona, summer afternoons had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the steady hum of cicadas and the faint scent of creosote drifting from the desert. 8-year-old Abby Harper pedaled her bike along the cracked shoulder of the county road, the back wheel squeaking with every revolution. Her hair clung to the back of her neck under her helmet, and her pink t-shirt was darkened with sweat. She had been heading home from the corner store, a paper bag of popsicles melting against her ribs, when movement ahead made her slow down. Two shapes stood in the middle of the road, so small against the glaring horizon that she almost mistook them for tumbleweeds. Then they moved. Two German Shepherd puppies, identical in size, fur glinting gold and black in the sunlight, stood upright on their hind legs, front paws lifted together as if in prayer. Abby braked hard, her sneakers scraping the ground, the bag of popsicles tipping in the basket. For a moment, she could only stare. She'd seen dogs beg for treats, sure, but never like this. There was no playful bounce in them, no wagging tails. One puppy's head tilted, his amber eyes locked on hers, full of something she could only describe as desperation. The other took a step back, then looked over its shoulder toward the scrubland beyond the road, ears twitching, body tense. It wanted her to follow. Abby's first instinct was to pedal away, fast. The desert could hide anything. Snakes, coyotes, worse. But there was something in those eyes that rooted her in place, something that made her throat tighten. "Hey, what's wrong, boy?" she whispered, though she didn't know why she was speaking so softly. The puppy in front whined, then darted a few steps toward the brush, glancing back to see if she was coming. The other stayed in the road, still on hind legs, paws lifted as if pleading. Abby swallowed, her heart thumping. Her uncle's words came back to her, the ones he always said before she went exploring. "If something feels wrong, call me first." She slid her backpack off her shoulders, pulled out her phone, and hit the speed dial for Uncle Joseph. He answered on the second ring. "Abby, you okay?" You're not going to believe me," she said, glancing at the puppies again. "Two little German shepherds. They're begging. I think they want me to go with them." There was a pause on the line. "Where are you?" "County Road 14, near Miller's old windmill. They're acting weird, Uncle Joe, like they're trying to tell me something." "Stay where you are. I'm on my way. And Abby, don't follow them until I get there, okay?" She hesitated, watching as the second puppy gave another sharp whine and started retreating into the brush, his little paws quick against the dust. The one in the road whimpered, eyes darting between her and the direction. His sibling had gone. "I'll stay," she said reluctantly. "But hurry." 5 minutes later, the low growl of a police SUV cut through the heat. Deputy Joseph Harper pulled up, stepping out in his khaki uniform, his dark hair damp with sweat under his hat. Beside him leapt down Cooper, his K-9 partner, a large, disciplined German shepherd whose presence made the puppies freeze in place. "Where?" Joseph asked. Abby pointed toward the brush. "That way. One of them's still—" But Cooper had already caught the scent. His hackles rose slightly, a low, alert rumble in his chest. Joseph's hand rested on his leash, but the dog pulled toward the roadside, nostrils flaring, tail stiff. "Something's got him worked up," Joseph murmured. "This isn't just a lost pet situation." The puppy that had stayed in the road trotted toward the brush now, glancing back at them every few steps. Cooper whined, tugging hard. Joseph nodded. "All right, let's see what's got you all riled up." The path through the mesquite was narrow, branches clawing at their clothes. The air smelled of dust and something else, sharp, metallic, almost like old coins. They broke into a small clearing, and that's when Abby's breath caught. Under the shade of a gnarled mesquite tree lay an older German shepherd, her sides rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Her coat, once thick and proud, was patchy and matted with dirt. Around her neck hung a thin chain with a tarnished pendant. Joseph crouched, brushing the dirt from it. "Grace," he read aloud. Beneath the name was a tiny, frayed scrap of fabric tied loosely, as if someone had placed it there for a reason long ago. Joseph's brow furrowed. He knew the look in this dog's eyes, a distant, unwavering calm, even in pain. He'd seen it before. Cooper approached slowly, sniffing, then let out a soft whimper, nudging Grace's muzzle gently. The two puppies pressed against her, their small bodies trembling. Abby knelt beside them, her small hands reaching to stroke their fur. "What happened to her?" she asked in a whisper. Joseph didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the pendant, the frayed cloth, and the faint, almost imperceptible smell of antiseptic clinging to it. He felt something stir deep in his chest, something that hadn't stirred in years, since Afghanistan. He exhaled slowly, the weight of an unspoken truth hanging between them. "I don't know yet, kiddo, but I think Grace has a story we need to hear." And as the wind rattled the dry leaves overhead, Joseph felt the first flicker of a mystery that was about to pull them all in, deeper than any of them could imagine. The air in the Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic was cool and sharp with the smell of disinfectant, a relief from the heat outside. Joseph stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed, watching Dr. Weller examine Grace on the stainless steel table. Abby sat on a bench in the corner, holding both puppies in her lap. They trembled, but they didn't try to wriggle free. "She's dehydrated," Dr. Weller said, running practiced hands over Grace's frail body. "Some infected wounds on her hindquarters, likely from wire or rope. Older injuries, too. See this scar on her flank? Looks like shrapnel damage." Joseph's chest tightened. Shrapnel. The word alone carried weight. He'd seen what it did to flesh and bone, on the battlefield in the kennels after a mission gone wrong. He thought of Cooper's predecessor, a big sable shepherd named Ranger. Afghanistan, 7 years ago. One night mission, a small village wired with explosives. Ranger had found the device, lunged in to block Joseph's squad, and the blast had taken him instantly. Joseph had never forgiven himself for not spotting the tripwire first. The guilt had sunk into him like lead, heavy and unmovable. Now, looking at Grace, he felt it again, that sharp, ugly twist in the gut. Dr. Weller lifted the thin chain around Grace's neck. "This yours?" she asked Joseph. "Number found her like that? Pendant says, Grace." He held out the small scrap of cloth that had been tied to it. "This was knotted here. Smells familiar, but I can't place it." Weller sniffed, frowned. "Antiseptic. And something else. Soap, maybe. Old-fashioned kind. You don't smell that much unless someone's using a specific product." Joseph turned to Cooper, who sat alert near the door. He crouched and let Cooper sniff the cloth. The reaction was instant. The K9's muscles went rigid, hackles rising. A low growl vibrated from deep in his chest. Then Cooper began pawing at the floor, nails scraping metal as if trying to dig into the scent itself. Abby's eyes went wide. "He's mad. I've never seen him like that." Joseph rested a hand on Cooper's neck. "Easy, boy. It's okay." But he knew it wasn't. Cooper wasn't just reacting. He was remembering. Dogs didn't forget smells tied to strong emotion, and this one was pulling something raw out of him. "Can you trace it?" Dr. Weller asked. "Maybe," Joseph said, "but first I need to know where Grace came from." While Weller prepped fluids for Grace, Joseph stepped outside, phone to his ear. Through an old contact in the county records office, he traced the pendant. It wasn't much. Grace had been licensed 3 years ago to a man named Henry Maddox. The name rang a bell, but faintly. Joseph did some digging while leaning against the SUV. Maddox had been a Marine Corps explosives specialist, medically discharged after an IED blast. He'd been living quietly on the outskirts of Willow Creek. 6 months ago, he'd passed away from complications tied to PTSD and injuries from service. There was no mention of Grace in the obituary. No family listed, except for a brother who lived 3 counties away. Joseph called him. The man's voice was guarded at first, but it cracked when Joseph mentioned Grace. "She was his shadow," the brother said. "After Henry died, the dog vanished. We thought maybe the VA took her, but when I asked around, nobody knew. His neighbor, some guy named Harlan, said he'd find her a good home." Joseph's fingers tightened on the phone. "Harlan have a last name?" "Fisk, kept to himself. Always seemed to have some angle. I didn't like the way he looked at Henry's stuff after the funeral." Joseph thanked him, hung up, and sat there for a moment, watching the shimmer of heat rise off the blacktop. Pieces were starting to fit together, and he didn't like the picture forming. When he went back inside, Abby was on the floor with the puppies, her voice soft and steady as she told Grace about her day. The old dog lay with an IV line taped to her leg, eyes half closed, but her ears twitched at Abby's words. Joseph sat beside his niece. "You like her, huh?" "She's sad," Abby said simply, "like she misses someone she loves, and I think she knows I miss Mom." That last part landed hard. Joseph put a hand on her shoulder. Abby had been only 5 when his sister, her mother, passed away. He'd done his best to fill the space, but there were some gaps you couldn't patch with just love and effort. "I think she likes you too," he said quietly. The door jingled as someone stepped in. A tall woman with dark hair tied back in a severe bun strode to the counter, flashing an FBI badge before anyone could ask. "Special Agent Doris Heller," she announced, her gaze locked on Joseph. "You found the shepherd?" "Grace," he corrected. "Yeah. What's the Bureau want with her?" Heller studied him for a beat. "I'm tracking a man named Harlan Fisk. He's suspected of defrauding veterans, especially those with PTSD, out of benefits, possessions, sometimes even their service dogs. We've got 3 missing K9s linked to his last known addresses." Joseph's jaw clenched. "Sounds like our guy." "Where'd you find her?" Joseph gestured toward Abby. "She was riding her bike. The puppies came out to the road and—" "They begged," Abby cut in, "like they were asking me to come with them." Heller's brow furrowed, but she didn't question it. "Any idea where Fisk is now?" Abby hesitated, chewing her lip. I might know a place." Joseph turned to her. "What do you mean?" "You know the trails behind the old Miller cabin?" she said. "Last fall, me and Dad went hiking. I saw that man, Harlan, out there with a big black truck. Grace was with him then, I think. There's this turn in the trail where there's a fence and an old metal shed." Joseph's pulse quickened. "Can you draw it?" Abby nodded. Within minutes, she had sketched the bend in the path, the shed, the fence. When she slid it across the table, Cooper was already on his feet, staring at the paper. Joseph glanced at Heller. "We've got a lead." The agent's expression was tight, but there was a spark in her eyes. "Then we'd better move fast. If Fisk's there, he won't wait around." Joseph looked down at Grace, at the slow rise and fall of her ribs, at the 2 puppies pressed close to her side. His throat tightened. He had failed one war dog before. He wasn't going to fail another. "All right," he said, voice low but steady. "Let's bring her justice." Morning in Willow Creek came slowly, the kind of desert dawn where light spills over the horizon in gold and copper, pushing the cool night air out of every shadow. Joseph stood at the window of his kitchen, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the first rays stretch across the yard. Out there, under the cottonwoods, Abby sat cross-legged in the grass with Grace and the 2 puppies. Scout was gnawing clumsily at an old tennis ball while Ranger pawed at Abby's shoelaces. Grace lay a little apart, her front paws folded neatly under her chest, the thin chain still around her neck catching the light. Abby's small hands moved gently over the old shepherd's head and ears, a rhythm almost hypnotic, and though Grace's eyes stayed half-closed, there was a softness in them that hadn't been there the day before. It was quiet, not just the absence of noise, but the sort of quiet where you can hear your own thoughts whether you want to or not. Joseph had been living with that kind of quiet for years, long before his sister's passing, long before Abby came to live under his roof. It had been the silence of long roads, empty nights, and memories that could wake you faster than any alarm. Now, the silence was different. It was shared. Grace's recovery was slow but steady. Dr. Weller had given Joseph a strict regimen, antibiotics, wound cleaning, short walks only, but already the old shepherd was moving a little more each day. The puppies seemed to sense her limits and rarely strayed far from her side. Abby had taken it upon herself to help with every task, from refilling water bowls to holding the leash during gentle evening walks down the gravel lane. Joseph watched the 3 of them together and thought about how bonds formed without permission, without warning. He could see it happening between Abby and Grace, the way the girl's shoulders seemed to loosen when she was near the dog, the way Grace leaned just enough to touch without pressing. There was no rush in it, no need for words. But under the surface of that quiet, something else was moving. The day before, after Abby had drawn the map of the trail near the old Miller cabin, Special Agent Doris Heller had spent the evening cross-referencing it with Bureau files. Harlan Fisk had been linked to several rural properties, most of them in out-of-the-way places where no one asked questions. Doris had told Joseph they'd need more than a sketch to get a warrant, but she wasn't dismissing Abby's memory. In fact, she seemed almost certain they were close. For now, Heller was keeping her distance, letting Joseph and Abby settle with Grace. The Bureau had its pace, its protocols, but Joseph had learned in both war and law enforcement that sometimes the clock runs out while you wait for paperwork. That morning, he took Cooper out for a run through the back fields. The K-9 moved with disciplined purpose, but his attention kept snagging on the faint scent of the cloth from Grace's collar. Joseph had tucked it in a sealed evidence bag, yet Cooper still glanced toward the shelf where it sat every time they came in from outside. Whatever that scent carried, it had carved deep into the dog's memory. By mid-morning, Abby had convinced Joseph to let her set up a blanket under the old elm near the fence line. She read to Grace there, nothing complicated, just the tattered paperback stories she'd loved since she was little. The puppies sprawled at her feet, dozing in the heat, their small chests rising and falling in sync. Every so often, Grace would shift closer, pressing her head against Abby's knee, and Abby would pause to rub her ears before continuing. It was in those moments Joseph realized that the girl's grief showed itself most honestly, not in tears, but in the way she poured quiet care into someone else. Abby had learned early that love was something you gave without asking for return. Grace, in her own battered way, seemed to understand that better than most humans Joseph knew. That afternoon, Doris stopped by unannounced. She didn't come inside right away. Instead, she leaned on the fence watching Abby and the dogs. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes followed every movement. When Joseph joined her, she spoke without looking away. "She's good with them," Doris said. "You can't teach that kind of trust. Dogs either believe in you or they don't." "She's been through a lot," Joseph replied. "So has Grace." Doris nodded slowly. "So have you." It wasn't a question, and Joseph didn't answer. They stood there for a while, the low hum of insects in the grass filling the space between words. Then Doris told him what she'd learned. Fisk had been seen 2 counties over, buying supplies, nothing traceable, all in cash. The truck Abby remembered matched descriptions from other cases tied to missing K-9S. Joseph's jaw tightened. "You think he still has others?" "I think," Doris said, "that if your niece saw him in those woods, he was comfortable there. That means there's a reason, storage, training, or something worse." She left shortly after, but her words lingered in Joseph's mind through the rest of the day. That evening, clouds rolled in from the west, pulling the heat out of the air. Joseph took Abby, Grace, and the puppies for a slow walk down the lane. Cooper ranged ahead, alert but relaxed. The dust smelled faintly of rain, though the storm was still miles away. Halfway back to the house, Abby spoke without looking up. "Uncle Joe." Grace still looks around sometimes, like she's waiting for somebody. Joseph followed her gaze. The shepherd's ears were up, her eyes scanning the horizon even as her steps stayed light beside Abby's. "Maybe she is," Joseph said quietly. "Or maybe she's just making sure no one can sneak up on you." Abby smiled a little at that, but Joseph felt the weight of it. Grace had been left behind once. He wasn't about to let it happen again. That night, after Abby was asleep and the dogs were settled, Joseph sat at the kitchen table with the map Abby had drawn. He traced the path with his finger, seeing it not as lines on paper, but as terrain. Turns, cover, vantage points. Cooper lay at his feet, eyes half closed but ears twitching with every sound outside. Somewhere in those woods was the truth about Grace, and Joseph knew that when the time came to walk that trail, it wouldn't be in daylight or safety. It would be in the same kind of quiet that bound him now to a wounded dog, a determined child, and a past he still hadn't fully outrun. But this time, the quiet wouldn't be empty. It would be full of purpose. The morning broke gray and heavy, a low sky pressing down on Willow Creek as though it knew something was about to shift. The air was sharp with the scent of wet earth from the night's brief rain, and the wind pushed cold fingers through the cottonwoods in Joseph's yard. Grace stood at the fence line with her head lifted, ears pricked toward the distant hills, as if she could hear something the rest of them could not. Joseph had been up before dawn, moving with the slow precision of someone preparing for a task that could not be done twice. His badge was tucked under his jacket, his service weapon cleaned and loaded. Cooper, sensing the change in energy, paced the kitchen floor without a sound, his dark eyes following every movement. On the table lay Abby's map, now marked with red ink from Doris's research, points of possible access, ridgelines, and the faint outline of a creek that cut the forest like a vein. They gathered at the sheriff's substation just after first light. Doris was already there, her unmarked SUV idling in the lot. Behind her, 2 SWAT trucks sat in silence, their black paint absorbing the morning gloom. The men and women inside were gearing up, checking weapons and securing gear with the economy of motion that comes from knowing there's no room for error. Joseph said little as they rolled out toward the northern ridge. The gravel road wound between stands of juniper and mesquite, then narrowed into a track barely wide enough for the convoy. Every so often Cooper would lift his head from the passenger seat and stare into the trees, his nose twitching. Joseph knew better than to ignore that instinct. A working dog's sense for danger was often sharper than a man's years of training. The trailhead was nothing more than a break in the brush, the kind of place you could pass 100 times without noticing. But Abby's memory had been exact. 50 yards past a leaning fence post, a sun-bleached cattle skull nailed above it, the entrance cut into the undergrowth like a wound. The SWAT point man signaled halt, and the team slipped from their vehicles into the cold hush of the forest. The canopy swallowed them almost instantly. Light fractured through the pines in narrow blades, and the ground underfoot was a patchwork of needles and mud. Joseph walked just behind the lead element, Cooper on his left, Doris on his right. Every sense was stretched thin, pulling in sound and movement, the smell of damp bark, the faint metallic tang of rain on stone. Half a mile in, Cooper froze, his muscles locked beneath his coat, head thrust forward, ears stiff. Joseph stopped immediately, one hand raised in silent signal. The others held their breath as the dog lowered his head to the ground, inhaled, then swung it toward the dense brush ahead. A low, rolling growl vibrated from his chest, a warning as clear as any spoken word. Joseph stepped forward, scanning the ground. That's when he saw it. A thin line, almost invisible, unless you were looking for it, stretched ankle-high across the trail. He followed it with his eyes to a crude device hidden under a mound of moss and sticks. The dull glint of wire and metal told the rest of the story. "Tripwire," Joseph murmured. Doris's hand landed on his shoulder, her face tight. She motioned the SWAT tech forward, and in minutes the device was disarmed, a crude but lethal trap wired to a small explosive. Cooper had likely saved every life in the column. Joseph knelt, pressing his hand briefly to the dog's neck in silent praise before they moved on. The deeper they went, the more deliberate the signs became. Boot prints in the soft earth, a cigarette butt still damp from the night, the faint smell of fuel. The trail bent sharply, and through the trees Joseph caught the shape of a structure. Not a cabin, but something rougher. A long shed built from mismatched lumber, its roof patched with corrugated tin. SWAT fanned out, silent shadows in the gloom. Joseph, Cooper, and Doris moved in from the flank. The shed's door was ajar, creaking with each push of the wind. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of oil, mildew, and fear. Cages. 3 along the left wall, 2 along the right. All empty, but the bedding inside still held the warmth of recent use. On a workbench, piles of collars, some with military tags, others with worn leather straps that spoke of long service. Joseph's stomach turned as he recognized the kind of gear issued to K-9 units overseas. Grace could have been in one of these cages, nameless and forgotten, waiting for whatever purpose Harlan had intended. Movement at the far end of the shed drew his eyes. A man bent over a stack of crates, his back to them. Broad-shouldered, clothes dirty but deliberate, pockets heavy with tools. Doris stepped forward, her voice sharp but low. "Harlan Fisk, don't move." He straightened slowly, hands rising, but Joseph saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. It was the look of someone measuring distance, weighing chances. Cooper barked once, a sound that split the silence. Harlan's gaze darted toward the open crates, and Joseph caught a glimpse inside. Folded uniforms, medals, and framed photos, each tied to a name on the collars. This wasn't just theft. It was desecration. The arrest happened fast, SWAT moving in, Harlan cuffed and pushed to his knees. But the tension didn't break. Grace had been brought forward with another officer, her eyes locked on Harlan. For a heartbeat, the old shepherd stood still. Then her body stiffened. From deep in her chest came a sound that was not a bark, not a whine, but something older. A guttural growl shaped by memory and betrayal. Harlan flinched. In that moment, Joseph didn't see just an old dog. He saw a soldier recognizing her enemy. The evidence was overwhelming. Boxes of stolen belongings, files with names and service numbers, photographs of handlers and dogs clearly taken without consent. Doris's team began cataloging it all, but Joseph's mind stayed fixed on the cages, on what they represented. He thought of the men and women who had trusted this man to care for their partners, only to have them stolen, sold, or worse. As they led Harlan out into the dim afternoon, rain began to fall again, soaking the pine needles and turning the trail slick. Joseph walked beside Grace, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Cooper trotted ahead, checking the path with the same careful watch that had saved them earlier. The forest felt different now, not quieter but heavier, as though the trees themselves were holding the weight of what had been hidden here. The truth was no longer buried, but it would take time to reckon with all it had uncovered. When they reached the vehicles, Doris gave Joseph a long look. "This isn't the end," she said. "People are going to have questions, and some of them won't like the answers." Joseph glanced down at Grace. Her eyes were calmer now, but the edge was still there, a readiness, a refusal to forget. "Then we give them the truth," he said. "All of it." And as the convoy pulled away from the ridge, leaving the shed and its secrets behind, Joseph knew the hardest part was still ahead. Saving Grace had been the first step. Restoring what was taken from her, and from every handler who'd lost a partner to greed, would be the real fight. The rain followed them all the way back to town. The days after the raid on Falcon Ridge unfolded like the slow turn of a heavy wheel, each rotation bringing new revelations from the wreckage Harlan Fisk had left behind. The shed was only the mouth of a deeper tunnel, one lined with years of deceit, manipulation, and quiet cruelty. Doris's team uncovered records that went far beyond Willow Creek, each one a thread leading into neighboring counties and then across state lines. It was more than stolen K-9s. Bank transfers traced to shell charities, deeds signed over under pressure from veterans too broken to fight, medical supply shipments diverted, their inventory ending up in pawned crates like the ones Joseph had seen in the shed. And for each name in the files, there was a dog, often the last living piece of the handler's service, taken under the guise of rehoming and then vanished into the ether. Some were sold, others, no one could say for certain. The Bureau moved quickly. Arrests in 3 counties. Storage units filled with the remnants of men and women's lives. Joseph wasn't surprised when the local news descended, cameras eager to frame the whole thing as a story of heroics and justice. But what stayed with him wasn't the headlines. It was the faces. The look in the eyes of the handlers who came to identify their partners' collars, some breaking down when they realized the dogs were gone for good. Grace was different. She had survived long enough to be found, and in that survival was something harder to define than luck. There was will in it. There was fight. In the quiet of his kitchen one evening, Joseph sat with the files Doris had let him keep, a stack connected directly to Grace's chain. At the top was Henry Maddox's record, service commendations clipped to the front. Beneath them, a photograph. Maddox kneeling beside Grace in desert camo, her coat full and shining, his hand resting with an ease that spoke of years of trust. Joseph traced the edges of the photo, feeling the shape of something familiar. Loss tempered by pride, the knowledge that you had once stood beside the best and done your part. Appy was outside in the fading light, tossing a ball for Scout and Ranger. Grace lay nearby, head low but eyes following each throw, as if she were quietly supervising. Cooper lounged under the porch steps, content but ready, as always, to move at a moment's notice. The town had rallied. The square was set for the weekend. Tables, bunting, the old wooden stage swept clean for the ceremony. It wasn't just about Grace, though her name was on every flyer. It was about giving the story an ending people could hold on to, one that made the ugliness in those files seem like something that could be beaten back. But Joseph knew the truth was more complicated. The network Fisk had served was damaged, but not dead. Doris had been blunt with him the night before. There were still names they couldn't touch yet, still warehouses they couldn't find. And yet, there was this moment, this town, this dog who had been carried out of the dark and now lay in the sun. The morning of the ceremony broke crisp and clean, the sky a deep, unbroken blue. Joseph arrived early, walking Grace through the square before the crowd filled in. Vendors setting up stalls paused to watch them pass. Some reached out to touch Grace's head, others simply nodded, understanding more than words could say. By midday, the square was full. The mayor spoke first, his voice carrying easily in the dry air. Then Doris, careful and precise, outlining the investigation without bleeding into the details too heavy for a public stage. When it was Joseph's turn, he didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Abby, standing with the puppies at the edge of the stage, and at Grace, sitting steady beside him. "People talk about courage," he began, voice low but clear, "like it's something that just happens. But courage is a choice. It's made in the space between fear and action. Grace made that choice long before we found her. She made it every day she survived what was done to her, every day she kept going when it would have been easier to stop." He paused, resting his hand on the shepherd's back. "She didn't do it alone. None of us do. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we get to stand beside someone, or some dog, who reminds us why we keep going." The medal they placed around Grace's neck caught the sunlight, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were on the crowd, calm and unwavering. That night the house felt different. Not louder, not busier, just more alive. Abby had set a bed for Grace in her room, insisting it was temporary until Joseph relented. Scout and Ranger tumbled over each other in the hallway, their nails clicking on the wood floor. Cooper settled in his usual spot by the back door, keeping watch over it all. Joseph stood in the doorway for a long time, letting it sink in. The fight wasn't over. Somewhere beyond the dark line of the hills, the rest of Fisk's network still breathed. But for tonight, Grace was home. Abby was safe, and the house was no longer quiet in that hollow way it had been for years. In the days to come, there would be more calls from Doris, more drives down long roads to cold storage units, more names to cross off. But every road led back here to this place where the air smelled of mesquite and warm fur, and the sound of laughter from the living room could push back the ghosts for a while. Sometimes, Joseph thought, you don't find home. Sometimes it finds you, out on a road in the heat, in the eyes of an animal too proud to beg except for someone else's sake, and when it does, you hold on, no matter how far you have to carry it. Outside, under a night sky scattered with stars, Grace lifted her head into the breeze, her chain and pendant glinting faintly in the moonlight. The world was still wide and dangerous, but here, in this yard, in this town, she had found her place, and so had he.